The night was restless, choked in static-filled air and the scent of metal decay. Wind howled through the hollow carcasses of abandoned ships, their twisted hulls like skeletal remains scattered across the wasteland. Somewhere, past the ruins, beyond the shifting dunes of ash and glass, lightning forked in eerie silence, illuminating the sky in brief, unnatural pulses. A storm was coming. Ethan had learned to listen to the wind, to the creak of the earth, and the way it whispered through the wreckage. The planet was old and dying, its very bones groaning beneath the weight of its own ruin. He pulled his mask tighter against his face, the filters barely dulling the acrid scent that clung to everything. Scavenging was always worse before a storm. The atmosphere turned volatile. Pockets of radiation rose unpredictably, and sometimes the silence would break with a sound that didn't belong. A voice. A breath. The ghost of something that shouldn't exist in a place long abandoned. He ignored the way his gut twisted. Fear had no place out here. Only instinct. Picking his way over a collapsed fuselage, Ethan kept his grip firm on the rifle slung across his back. The weapon was old, patched together from different models over the years, but it had saved his life more times than he could count. The settlement would be shutting down for the night soon, the barricades sealing tight, and if he didn't get back before then, he'd be spending the night outside. And no one lasted a night outside. But he had seen something. Half buried under the remains of a shuttle, just past the old perimeter. It had been a glimmer of movement, something catching the light where nothing should have been. He could have ignored it. Should have. But something in him had hesitated, had turned his boots in that direction, even as his mind warned against it. Now, standing at the wreckage's edge, he realized it wasn't debris he had seen. It was a body. Ethan crouched low, heart tightening as his eyes adjusted to the dim glow of his visor's interface. It wasn't human. The limbs were too long, the proportions just slightly wrong. She, he thought it was a she, lay curled on her side, half covered in shattered glass and debris, her breathing shallow. Her skin wasn't like any species he had encountered before. It shimmered faintly, pulsing like the surface of a dying star, hues of violet and silver shifting in slow waves. Blood, if that's what it was, had pooled beneath her, dark and iridescent, soaking into the ground. She was still alive. Barely. Ethan swore under his breath. He should leave. Nothing good ever came from getting involved in things like this. The unspoken rule of the wastelands, if you find something that isn't yours, walk away. And yet, he didn't move. Instead, he reached for her, pressing 2 fingers against the side of her throat, feeling for a pulse. The skin beneath his fingertips was warm, too warm, almost feverish. A faint tremor rippled through her, the slow rise and fall of her chest shallow but steady. Her eyes snapped open. Ethan froze. For a second, neither of them moved. Her pupils contracted sharply, shifting like liquid mercury, reflecting the faint glow of his visor's interface. Then her lips parted, just slightly, and she exhaled a word in a language he didn't recognize. It wasn't a plea, not a request for help. It was something else. A warning. Ethan barely had time to react before the ground beneath them trembled. A vibration, not natural, not from the storm. His instincts screamed, and he swung his rifle off his back, just as something in the distance let out a low, mechanical whir. Not alone. His decision was made for him. Without another second of hesitation, he scooped the alien girl into his arms, her body unnaturally light, her warmth sinking through the fabric of his jacket. She stiffened but didn't resist. If anything, she curled slightly against him, her breathing ragged, her energy spent. Then, behind them, the wreckage groaned. Ethan turned just in time to see movement in the distance. Dark shapes shifting between the ruins, their silhouettes inhuman, too smooth, too deliberate. Machines, not the scavenger-built kind, the other kind, the kind that hunted. Shit, he muttered, adjusting his grip on the girl and bolting toward the settlement. He could hear them now, the sound of metal against stone, the precision of their steps too measured, too controlled. He had no doubts. They weren't just wandering. They were searching, and if they had found her, they would find him too. The storm rolled closer, thunder crackling in the distance, the scent of rain thickening the air. Ethan ran, his breath controlled, his boots crunching against loose gravel. The barricades were ahead, still open, the settlement's outer defenses blinking in low-power mode. If he could just... A sharp hiss cut through the air. A projectile struck the ground inches from his foot, sending up a spray of dust and metal shards. He cursed, twisting his body to shield the girl as he pushed forward, ignoring the burn in his muscles, the weight in his arms. The settlement was close. So close. Then, an automated turret activated overhead. A blaring warning sounded, and within seconds, the barricades began to seal. "Hold the damn gate!" Ethan roared, his voice hoarse from exertion. There was a pause. Then, through his earpiece, a crackled reply. "Ethan?" a voice barked. "What the hell are you doing out there?" "Later," he snapped. "Just keep it open." The machines were closing in, their footsteps gaining speed, no longer hiding. They had seen him. They knew. A final burst of effort, and Ethan threw himself through the narrowing gap of the settlement's entrance. The metal doors slammed shut behind him, cutting off the sound of pursuit, leaving only the heavy thud of his heartbeat in his ears. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a weak whisper against his chest. A voice, barely audible. "Safe?" Ethan looked down. The alien girl was watching him, her mercury eyes unfocused, her body slack in his arms. She was shaking, not from fear, from relief. Ethan exhaled, the weight of what he had just done crashing down on him. He had brought something into the settlement, something that didn't belong, something the machines wanted, and he had a feeling this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The settlement's air was thick with rust and ozone, a blend of old machinery and the lingering traces of the storm outside. Dim overhead lights flickered against corrugated metal walls, casting elongated shadows through the narrow corridors. The space was tight, built more for function than comfort, scrap-reinforced bulkheads, patched wiring running along the ceilings like veins, the distant hum of generators straining against overuse. It smelled of oil, sweat, and the faint, acrid bite of disinfectant. Ethan moved through it with practiced ease, his arms still tight around the unconscious alien girl. His breath was steady now, his pulse slower, but his thoughts remained a tangle of unanswered questions. The weight of what he had just done, bringing something unknown past the settlement's walls, pressed against him, heavier than the body in his arms. He knew the rules. Survivors didn't take risks, they didn't bring in strays, and they sure as hell didn't invite trouble inside the last patch of habitable land on this forsaken planet. A voice crackled in his earpiece. "You better be ready to explain yourself." Ethan exhaled sharply. "I know, Wade." Wade Varick was waiting for him at the end of the corridor, arms crossed, a deep frown cutting across his scarred face. He was older, mid-40s maybe, built like someone who had spent half his life carrying more weight than he should have. His heavy-duty jacket was stained with grease, the sleeves rolled up to expose forearms lined with burns and old lacerations. Wade wasn't just security, he kept the settlement running, maintained its systems, decided who came in and out, and Ethan had just made his job a whole lot harder. "You're out of your damn mind," Wade muttered, his sharp blue eyes flicking to the girl. "What is this?" "Not a what," Ethan corrected. "A who." Wade's jaw tightened. "You know what I mean." Ethan adjusted his grip, shifting the girl's weight slightly. She was breathing steadily, but she hadn't stirred since the gates closed. Up close, her skin had taken on a strange translucence, her veins glowing faintly beneath the surface in slow, rhythmic pulses. "I found her out past the perimeter," Ethan said finally. "She was half buried in the wreckage." "You should have left her there." Ethan didn't answer, because he had considered it. He had stood there, staring down at the unknown, at the risk she represented, and for a long, stretched-out moment, he had nearly walked away. But he hadn't. Wade let out a slow breath. "We don't have the resources for this. If she's sick..." "She's not sick," Ethan cut in. "She's different." That was the only way he could describe it. She wasn't just some injured traveler or refugee. She was something else, something that had called to him in a way he still didn't fully understand. Wade muttered a curse under his breath. This settlement barely holds together as it is. You really think the others are going to be fine with this? They don't have to be, Ethan said, meeting his gaze. She's my responsibility. A heavy silence settled between them. Then, reluctantly, Wade jerked his head toward the infirmary door behind him. Get her inside. I'll send Kel in to check her over. Ethan nodded once and stepped past him, pushing the door open with his shoulder. The infirmary was one of the cleaner parts of the settlement, though that wasn't saying much. It was small. 3 metal cots, a single surgical table, and shelves lined with salvaged medical supplies. An old diagnostic scanner flickered in the corner, its screen blinking with outdated software. Ethan laid the girl down carefully on one of the cots, his hands lingering for a fraction of a second before he stepped back. She looked even more alien under the sterile lighting. Her face was delicate, but not in a fragile way. Sharp cheekbones, slightly elongated features, skin that shifted between dusky violet and pale silver depending on how the light hit it. Her hair, or what passed for hair, was a cascade of dark strands threaded with faintly glowing filaments, almost like fiber optic wiring. And yet, she looked peaceful. For a moment, Ethan simply stood there, studying her, searching for something he couldn't quite name. Then the door behind him hissed open. Kel Storms was already pulling on a pair of gloves as she stepped inside, her expression unreadable. She was younger than Wade, early 30s maybe, with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue. Her dark hair was cropped close to her head, her sleeves pushed up to reveal arms covered in ink, old symbols, some human, some not. She barely spared Ethan a glance as she moved past him. So, she muttered, pulling a scanner from her belt. You finally lost it, huh? Ethan sighed. Just check her over. Kel didn't argue. She ran the scanner slowly over the girl's body, frowning as data scrolled across the screen. The device beeped, cycling through several unfamiliar readings. Then Kel stiffened. What? Ethan asked. Kel's eyes narrowed, her fingers tapping at the screen. This can't be right. What? Ethan repeated, sharper this time. Kel turned the scanner toward him. She's healing. Ethan frowned. That's a good thing, isn't it? Kel exhaled, rubbing at the back of her neck. Yeah, but not like this. This isn't normal. She hesitated. Her cells aren't just regenerating. They're adapting, shifting. Ethan didn't like the sound of that. What does that mean? Kel shook her head. It means we don't know what we're dealing with. Ethan glanced back at the girl. Her breathing was steadier now, her color warmer, her expression no longer lined with pain. He had seen wounds like hers before, ones that should have taken weeks to mend, if they healed at all. And yet, here she was, repairing herself at an unnatural rate. He didn't know if that was a miracle or a warning. Then, just as he was about to speak, the girl stirred. A slow inhale, fingers twitching. Then, her eyes opened. Ethan had expected panic, confusion, maybe even fear. But when her gaze locked onto his, there was only one thing reflected in those mercury pool eyes. Recognition. Like she already knew him. Like she had been waiting for him. And in that moment, Ethan felt something shift. A quiet certainty. Whatever she was, whoever she was here for a reason. And his life, whether he wanted it to or not, had just changed forever. The silence between them stretched, thick with something unspoken, something unexplainable. The alien girl, still weak, still recovering, watched Ethan with those mercury-shifting eyes, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Kel, standing a few feet away, was the first to break the stillness. She exhaled sharply, rubbing her temples. Okay, she muttered, voice laced with exhaustion. She's awake. That's something. Ethan barely heard her. Because the girl wasn't just awake. She was looking at him like she knew him, like she had been expecting him. He cleared his throat, pushing down the strange weight settling in his chest. "Do you understand me?" he asked. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. Caution, curiosity, maybe something deeper. The girl blinked. Then, slowly, she parted her lips. Her voice, when it came, was soft, melodic in a way that wasn't entirely human. "Yes?" Ethan's pulse kicked. Kel stiffened beside him. "Well, that makes things easier," she muttered. But there was an unease in her tone, a tension that hadn't been there before. Ethan focused on the girl again. "What's your name?" She hesitated, tilting her head slightly, as if considering the question. Then, after a beat, she murmured, "Sierra." Sierra. The name curled around his thoughts, fitting too easily into the spaces that should have been empty. He didn't like it. Didn't like the way her presence unsettled something deep in his gut. Didn't like the way she was watching him, not with fear or wariness, but with certainty, like she had already decided something about him. Ethan set his jaw. "What were you doing out there?" Sierra's gaze flickered, just briefly, but he caught it. "Running," she said. One word, but it carried weight, thick and heavy, pressing into the cracks of an already fragile situation. Kel folded her arms. "From what?" Sierra didn't answer right away. Instead, she shifted, pushing herself up slightly, her movements slow but deliberate. The glow in her veins pulsed faintly, steadying, healing. Then, at last, she spoke. "The machines," she murmured. Ethan's stomach tightened. Behind him, Kel cursed under her breath. "Great." He barely heard her. His mind was already turning, piecing things together, sifting through every fragmented bit of information. The machines. They had been searching for her. He had seen them out there, moving with precision, with purpose. He had felt the way the air changed around them, like the very atmosphere had shifted in response to their presence. And if they had been after her then— "They won't stop," Sarah said quietly. Ethan met her gaze. "What do you mean?" "They are still looking." The words settled like lead. A sharp knock on the infirmary door shattered the moment. Ethan turned as Wade stepped inside, his face unreadable. But his posture, rigid, tense, was enough to tell him that something was wrong. "We have a problem," Wade said. Ethan already knew, but he asked anyway. "What kind?" Wade's eyes flicked to Sarah, then back to Ethan. Sensors picked up movement outside the perimeter. The room went still. Kel muttered another curse, rubbing at her temple. "Tell me you're joking." Wade didn't smile. "I don't joke about things like this." Ethan exhaled slowly. "How many?" Wade hesitated. 5, maybe more, but they're not advancing yet. Yet. The word echoed between them, heavy with unspoken implications. Ethan turned to Sierra. She was already watching him. "They won't leave," she murmured. "Not until they have what they came for." Ethan studied her, his mind working through every possible outcome, every possible choice. And none of them were good. The settlement was strong, reinforced with years of scavenged technology, modified defenses, and the sheer stubbornness of those who lived inside it. But it wasn't built to withstand a prolonged siege, and if the machines had truly come for her— He inhaled sharply, jaw tightening. "You said you were running," he said. "Why?" Sarah didn't flinch. "Because they won't stop." That's not an answer. Something flickered in her expression. Then finally she murmured, "Because I escaped." A beat of silence. Kel looked between them. "Escaped from what?" Sierra hesitated. Then, softly, carefully, she said, "I was not meant to leave." Ethan's gut twisted. Not meant to leave, which meant— "You were with them," he said, voice low. A statement, not a question. Sarah didn't deny it. Ethan's hands curled into fists. And you brought them here. A breath, then softly, I had nowhere else to go. Ethan's pulse hammered. The machines were out there, waiting. And now, so was she. A girl who wasn't supposed to exist outside their control. A girl they were willing to hunt across the wastelands to retrieve. And Ethan had just made a choice he couldn't take back. The settlement's air was different now, tense, charged with something unseen. Conversations had quieted to hushed murmurs, the usual hum of daily routines replaced by the unspoken awareness of an approaching threat. Even the old generators, their rhythmic pulse a constant presence in the settlement, seemed to groan under the weight of the unease settling over them. Ethan felt it in his bones, the pressure of something inevitable creeping closer. The machines were out there, waiting, watching. And they weren't leaving. Inside the infirmary, the atmosphere was just as heavy. Sierra sat on the edge of the cot now, no longer weak, no longer fragile. Her strange, luminous veins had dimmed, her breathing steady. If he hadn't seen her near death hours ago, he wouldn't have believed she had ever been injured, but Ethan wasn't thinking about that. He was thinking about what she had told him, that she had escaped, that she had been one of them. He studied her now, arms crossed, posture rigid. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Some sign that she was lying, that she was hiding something more dangerous than she had admitted. But she met his gaze evenly, unwavering, unafraid. Kel, leaning against the wall with her arms folded, exhaled sharply. We need answers. Fast. Ethan nodded. We don't have time for half-truths. Sarah's expression didn't change. I haven't lied to you. Then tell us everything, Ethan said. No more vague warnings, no more cryptic answers. What are they? What do they want? Sarah hesitated. Then, softly, they want me back. That much we figured, Kel muttered. Ethan took a slow step forward. Why? Another pause. Then finally Sarah spoke. They built me. The words landed like a shockwave, rippling through the air. Ethan felt his pulse skip, his breath catch for just a second before he forced himself to stay still, to stay unreadable. Kel's brows knit together. Built you? Sarah nodded, her voice quiet but certain. I was created, not born, engineered, designed. She hesitated. But I was not like the others. I was not meant to leave their control. Ethan's mind raced. He had seen artificial life before, enhanced humans, bioengineered hybrids, synthetic intelligence woven into flesh and bone. But Sierra, she was different. He had seen her bleed, felt her warmth, watched her suffer. She wasn't metal, wasn't machine in the way the things hunting her were, but she wasn't human either. Kel rubbed her temples, shaking her head. I don't like this. Ethan wasn't sure how he felt about it either, but the pieces were falling into place now, clicking into a shape that spelled trouble in ways he hadn't yet begun to unravel. Sarah wasn't just running from the machines. She was their creation, and they wanted her back. A sharp knock on the infirmary door made them all stiffen. Then before Ethan could react, Wade stepped inside, his face carved from stone. They're moving, he said grimly. Ethan's stomach tightened. How close? Too close. Wade's gaze flicked to Sarah, suspicion laced in his features. They're not waiting anymore. Kel muttered another curse. Ethan inhaled slowly, steadying himself. He had known this was coming, but now that it was real, now that the inevitable had arrived, his mind shifted into something sharper, something focused. We need a plan, he said. Wade scoffed. I have a plan. We send her out, let them take what they came for, and we go back to surviving like we always have. Sarah didn't react, but Ethan felt something cold settle in his chest. No, he said. Wade's eyes narrowed. You're risking all of us for something we don't even understand. Ethan stepped closer. I didn't bring her here to hand her over. You shouldn't have brought her here at all. The weight of Wade's words hung between them, thick with accusation, with frustration, with something dangerously close to resentment. And for the first time, Ethan realized. Wade wasn't just angry. He was afraid. The machines had never come this close before, never lingered on the outskirts of the settlement like this. Because until now, they had never had a reason to. And Ethan had given them one. A quiet beep sounded from Wade's wrist device. He glanced down, his face darkening. They're here. The words sent a chill down Ethan's spine. Not just close. Here. The world outside erupted into chaos. Alarms blared, echoing through the settlement's corridors. Distant shouts carried through the metal walls, the sound of boots pounding against reinforced flooring. And beneath it all, a low, unnatural hum. A sound Ethan recognized. The machines had arrived. He turned to Sierra. She was still watching him, unreadable, calm in a way that unsettled him more than anything else. Then softly, almost too softly to hear, she said, "They won't leave without me." Ethan clenched his jaw. "Then we don't give them what they want." Wade let out a bitter laugh. "You think you can stop them?" Ethan didn't answer, because he didn't know. All he knew was that for better or worse, he had made a choice. And there was no turning back. The sound of the alarms bled into everything, a shrill pulse that sent a tremor through the bones of the settlement. It wasn't just noise. It was a warning, a final call before everything they had built was tested against something bigger, something colder. Ethan stood at the threshold of the infirmary, listening. Outside, the settlement stirred to life in the worst possible way. Orders barked over comms, the heavy slam of reinforced gates being sealed, the low thrum of weapons being primed. The people here had fought before, had faced off against the dangers of the wasteland, but this was different. This was something none of them were ready for. Behind him, Wade paced like a caged animal, jaw tight with frustration. "You want to tell me what the hell your plan is?" Ethan exhaled slowly. He didn't have a plan. Not really. But he couldn't say that. Not now. "We need to get a visual," he said instead. Kel nodded, already moving toward the door. Perimeter Watch should have a feed. Ethan turned back to Sarah. She hadn't moved, but something in her posture had shifted. An unreadable stillness, like she was bracing for something inevitable. "They won't attack right away," she murmured. Ethan studied her. "How do you know?" "Because I was one of them." Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something almost bitter. "I know how they think." Ethan didn't know what to do with that, didn't know what to do with the fact that every time she spoke, the line between enemy and ally blurred just a little more. He clenched his jaw. "Then tell me what they're waiting for." Sierra met his gaze. "Me." A sharp chill crawled down Ethan's spine. "They won't destroy the settlement unless they have to," she continued. "Not yet. That's not their goal." Wade let out a harsh laugh. "That's comforting." Ethan ignored him. "Then what is their goal?" Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then, at last, she said, "To retrieve me. Or to make sure no one else does." Kel cursed under her breath. Ethan felt the weight of her words settle like lead in his chest. The machines weren't just hunting her. They were ensuring no one else had her either, which meant they would not stop, not until she was back in their grasp, or gone. Ethan inhaled sharply, forcing his mind to focus. "We don't have time for debates. If they want her, that means we have leverage." Wade scoffed. "Leverage? Against those things? They don't negotiate." Ethan turned to Sierra. "Is that true?" She hesitated. Then, quietly, "They do not think like you." Ethan frowned. "Explain." "They do not want war," Sierra said. "They do not seek destruction for its own sake. Every action is calculated, precise." She tilted her head slightly, the glow in her veins pulsing faintly beneath her skin. "They will take the path of least resistance." Ethan understood the implication. Give her up, and the settlement survives. Kel must have realized it too, because her expression darkened. "That's not an option. Wade threw up his hands. It's the only option. We don't even know what she is. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. She was standing right there, listening to them argue over her like she was a problem to be solved. A thing. An object. And yet, she didn't argue, didn't flinch, just watched, like she had already known this would happen. Ethan forced himself to look at her. Do you want to go back? A flicker of something passed over her face, too quick to name. Then, softly, she said, No. The single word settled in his gut like a stone. She wasn't asking for protection. She wasn't pleading for help. But she was telling him, with absolute certainty, that she would not return willingly. Ethan made his choice. No one is giving her up, he said. Wade stiffened. You're out of your mind. We don't know what she is, Ethan admitted. We don't know why they want her, but they're afraid of her. That's why they're not storming in. Wade's jaw clenched, but he didn't argue. Because Ethan was right, the machines were hesitating, and that meant they weren't invincible. Kel exhaled. So, what do we do? Ethan turned back to Sierra. We make them hesitate longer. For the first time, something flickered in her gaze. Not fear, not anger. Something else. Something like understanding. She inclined her head slightly, as if in acknowledgement. I can help, she murmured. Ethan didn't doubt that. But he wasn't sure if that was a good thing. The settlement had never been this silent before, even when storms howled through the valley, when raiders pressed too close to the perimeter, when resources ran thin, there was always movement, always the hum of life pushing forward. But now, as the machines stood at the gates, unmoving, waiting, the quiet was suffocating. Ethan stood at the edge of the command post, staring at the grainy surveillance feed. Shadows moved in the mist beyond the outer walls, shifting shapes with too many limbs, too much precision. The machines didn't pace, didn't fidget. They didn't need to. They had time. Ethan wasn't sure if he did. Behind him, Kel adjusted the charge pack on her rifle. Still no movement? No, Ethan murmured. They're waiting for us to make a move, Wade said, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Ethan knew Wade was still thinking about his version of a solution, giving Sarah up, sending her into the unknown in exchange for the settlement's survival. But Ethan also knew something else now, something that had been gnawing at the edges of his mind since the moment Sierra told them what she was. The machines didn't want her back to keep her safe. They wanted to erase her. That meant she was dangerous to them, and Ethan needed to know why. He turned away from the screens and looked at Sarah. She stood apart from the others, arms folded against herself, but not with fear. It was something else, something closer to resignation. She already knew how this would end. Ethan refused to let it be that simple. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Tell me the truth. All of it. Sierra's gaze met his, and for the first time, he saw something behind her expression, something fragile. Then she spoke. They created me to be different, she said. Not just another machine. Not just another calculation. Her eyes flickered, the strange glow in her veins pulsing like a heartbeat. They gave me something the others don't have. Ethan felt the answer forming before she even said it. A mind, she murmured. Not just programming. Not just logic. Something more. Ethan's pulse quickened. They made you sentient. Sarah nodded. And when they realized what they had done, they decided it was a mistake. A chill swept through him. He had suspected she was something unique, something engineered with a purpose he couldn't quite grasp. But this changed everything. Kel exhaled sharply. So they're afraid of you. Not just afraid, Sarah said softly. They believe I am a threat to their existence. If I survive, if I learn, I change them. I alter the design they have preserved for centuries. Ethan understood now. The machines were not afraid of Sierra because she could fight them. They were afraid of her because she could think beyond them. Because she could evolve. Because she was proof that they weren't as perfect as they believed themselves to be. Ethan clenched his jaw. That means they won't stop. No, Sarah agreed. They won't. Kel looked between them. Then what the hell do we do? Ethan didn't answer right away. He was still thinking, still piecing together a plan out of nothing but scattered fragments of information and the gnawing certainty that no matter what happened next, things would never go back to the way they were. They couldn't. He turned to Sarah. What do they fear most? Sarah hesitated. Then slowly she said, losing control. Ethan nodded, mind racing. Then that was what they would take from them. He stepped back, turning to the others. We draw them in. We make them second guess. We show them that Sierra isn't their asset anymore. His voice hardened. She's their failure. Wade scoffed. And what if they just decide to level the whole damn place instead? Ethan met his gaze. Then we give them something more important to focus on. Kel frowned. And what would that be? Ethan turned to Sierra again. You. A long silence stretched between them. Sierra studied him, her expression unreadable. You want to show them what I am? Yes. A slow breath. Then at last she nodded. And in that moment, Ethan realized she had been waiting for this, waiting for a choice, waiting for the chance to decide for herself. The alarms blared again. The machines were moving. Ethan clenched his fists. It was time. The night was still burning when the dust settled. Fires smoldered along the edges of the settlement, casting eerie shadows against the metal barricades. The bodies of broken machines lay strewn across the ground, some still twitching, their cores flickering like dying stars. The air smelled of scorched earth, ozone, and the faint metallic tang of something unnatural. Ethan stood at the heart of it all, gripping his rifle, though there was no one left to fight. His breath came ragged, his limbs heavy with exhaustion. His mind would not still. They had survived, but not because of him. He turned, his eyes searching through the wreckage until they found her. Sierra stood in the center of what had once been an enemy formation, her body still wreathed in a ghostly pulsing light. The glow in her veins had changed, shifting from its usual dim pulse into something wilder, something unshackled. She had been the one to end it. The machines had come, their relentless march unbroken, their logic unshaken. They had given the settlement an ultimatum, surrender her or be destroyed. But Sarah had met them before the gates. She had spoken to them, not as a subordinate, not as an anomaly to be corrected, but as something new, something beyond their understanding. And for the first time in their existence, the machines had hesitated. Then she had dismantled them, not with weapons, not with brute force, but with the very thing they feared most, herself. She had reached into their code, into the vast rigid network that bound them, and she had rewritten it, not with commands, with doubt, with something they had never been programmed to process. Choice. The now, their forms lay scattered and silent, no longer bound to their singular cold directive. Some had fled, some had simply stopped moving, as if no longer sure what to do without the certainty of their orders. And some had changed. Sierra stood among them, her face unreadable, watching as a handful of the surviving machines slowly lifted themselves from the ground, their movements cautious, almost uncertain. Ethan stepped toward her, his voice rough from smoke and adrenaline. Are they still dangerous? Sarah didn't answer immediately. Then, slowly, she shook her head. They are free. The weight of those words pressed against Ethan's chest. He looked at the machines, no longer enemies, no longer mindless enforcers of a singular will. They were something else now, something that had never existed before, something like her. Wade approached from behind, his face pale, streaked with soot. He still held his weapon, but there was no fight left in him. So, what now? Ethan exhaled. Now, Now everything was different. The settlement had survived, but its people had seen something tonight that they would not soon forget. They had witnessed something impossible, and impossible things did not go unnoticed. Sarah turned to him then, her eyes searching his. "I can't stay here." Ethan had known that was coming. The machines would return. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but one day. And not just them. Others would come. The scavengers, the raiders, the remnants of the old world who still clung to its dying embers. They would want to control her, to use her, to erase her. And Ethan knew, with absolute certainty, that Sierra would never be controlled again. He nodded. "I know." Kel stepped forward, her expression hesitant. "Where will you go?" Sierra glanced at the horizon, where the first hints of dawn had begun to bleed into the sky. The light caught in her eyes, turning them into something vast, something unknowable. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I want to find out." Ethan felt something deep in his chest tighten. A part of him wanted to tell her to stay, to fight alongside them, to build something new here, something safe. But Sierra wasn't meant for safety. She was meant for something bigger. He took a slow breath, then stepped forward, extending his hand. "If you ever need help," he said, "you know where to find me." For a moment, she just looked at him. Then finally, she smiled. A small thing, fleeting, but real. She reached out and took his hand. For a moment, the world was quiet. Then, as the sun broke over the horizon, Sierra turned, stepping forward into the unknown. And Ethan watched her go, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again.